Hello, welcome to Farmgate. I'm Finlay Costain, the editor of 8.9.com. Dr. Jonathan G Lundgren is an agroecologist, the founder and director of the Ecdysis Foundation and chief executive of Blue Dasher Farm. He's authored 107 peer-reviewed journal articles and has received the Presidential Early Career Award for Science and Engineering at the White House. Lundgren also served as an advisor on pesticide and GM crop risk assessments. Now, Jonathan Lundgren joins me now. Hi, Jonathan.
Hey, how are you doing?
Very well. Now, Jonathan, let's start with the big picture, sort of an overview. What, in your view, is the problem with mainstream agriculture? And, contrary to that, what's the solution?
Well, I think that the problem with agriculture is the same thing that's happening to society at large, right? Within agriculture, I think that someone convinced us a while ago that going bigger and simpler was the metric of being a good science or a good farmer. And and I understand why that would happen, right? The previous generation of small family farms, it was hard to keep the kids on the farm. It was hard to make a living doing that. You had to work hard. And in dry drops this industrialized mentality of large monocultures that are maintained with technology, essentially agrochemicals and new technologies. And that has added a certain level of security for a while, but farming became a mining operation under that scenario, and the mine is starting to run dry. And so uh, the answer is simple. Farmers, society at large needs to connect with the natural world, with family, and with community again. That solves a lot of problems, and it sounds kind of like, oh, geez, that's very hippie of you, John. But the reality is that those are really fundamental aspects of a successful farm. And and connecting with those items in our lives ends up delivering on a lot of things that are now being dubbed as regenerative outcomes.
Mm. Mm. You talked about the need for simplicity, wanting to make farming as simple as possible. But then you also talked about this sort of change in mindset, the change towards a more regenerative way of doing things as being simple as well. And I wonder if both things can be true at once. And I think one of the things that people are often nervous about in terms of regenerative agriculture is that it sounds complex. You're moving away from something which is relatively painting by numbers to something where you have to have a much better understanding
Yeah.
of nature's processes, of a range of different things. You have to think about it. Is that accessible for everybody?
It is very knowledge intensive. It's not technology intensive necessarily, whereas the industrialized system was technology intensive and less knowledge was needed. It was all replaced, or arguably, it could have been replaced. Um, is it something that all farmers can do? Absolutely. I think it's innately human to grow our own food, to take care of our families, to take care of our communities, and to take care of the natural resource base of our farms.
Mm, mm.
And so, yeah, absolutely.
There was something about the way that you phrased that there again. And I'm thinking about conversations that I have with farmers who aren't yet kind of, I guess, versed in regenerative agriculture in the way that you and I might be, and we might have a separate conversation. But this idea that we're feeding ourselves, our families, our communities, when of course an awful lot of farmers aren't doing that.
Exactly.
They're feeding distant supply chains.
Yes, yes, that's fundamental, isn't it? Um, I mean, can I say something controversial? Um, Within the industrialized system, at least in North America, and I don't know whether it's the same in the UK, there really is no way for the farmer to get ahead, right? In the US and Canada, I mean, every time that the farmer makes a bumper crop, the entire industry is poised to take every last penny
Mm.
of that profit. And no matter what the farmer does, there's no scenario in that system where the farmer wins. The only way that they win in the long term is by bucking that system. by starting to focus on their communities again, local supply chains, regional supply chains, knowing their customers, growing food. I was working with a farmer in North Carolina. So yeah, as part of our research, we visited 1,700 farms across North America that span from very conventional to very regenerative. And I was talking with one of the farmers. He was a blueberry grower. He's a veteran. Um, and he was using his farm as a way of kind of dealing with some of the things that he had experienced. And he grew blueberries, berries of various sorts, but we were eating the blueberries. They were organic, regenerative. And he was telling me all of the different ways, right, that he was growing it regeneratively, and all of the, the compost mix and the placement of the timing of the compost and the details of it, right? And and I stopped him and I asked him the question, what's it feel like? What's it feel like when you sell your blueberries at the local market? And he had to pause for a second and he thought, and he's like, it just feels so good to be able to share something that I've grown with people that I care about and to be able to tell them that it's safe, that there isn't a bunch of pesticides in it that are going to hurt their kids. So often we get wrapped up into the details, right? But that's not the heart of regenerative agriculture. The heart of regenerative agriculture is this sense of community development and family connection and appreciating and respecting in a humble way the natural world that is supporting that.
It sounds to me like power is quite an important part of this, that farmers have ceded power through their links to big business, to pesticides, to fertilizers, to long distance supply chains and corporations over the course of the last 70 years or so. And regenerative agriculture is about bringing the power home, but also, that
Yeah.
anecdote about the blueberries in the market, it's about bringing the joy home as well. You you
Yeah.
you you bring the power back and you bring the pleasure back.
Yeah. There's an elephant in the room, and farmers know that they're sick, right? They know. I mean, we've got the data that supports that. I mean, Parkinson's rates in our croppers of 2,000% of normal society, we're killing our farmers, right? For corporate greed. And somewhere along the line, I mean, I get it, okay? I mean, when our view of being a successful, good farmer is, I bought that next quarter of land, right? And we now farms in the U.S., grandpa and dad were real good at that. And now these farmers are sitting on thousands of acres, right? And the only way that they can farm that kind of ground that's tied into their identity, that's tied into their family history. If they lose that farm, they're letting generations down. And these farmers are trapped. And these corporations have figured this out. And they're milking these farmers for every penny they're worth.
Mm, mm. When
And
with
and so I think that
sorry,
there needs to be a mindset change, doesn't there?
mm,
Away from this idea that as a good farmer, I have to be big, right? As a good farmer, I have to have the cleanest fields in the county. As a good farmer, I have to produce the most food, the highest yields possible. Because those outputs, those outcomes, they aren't, they aren't, they aren't making us feel whole as a farmer, are they?
you started moving on to mindset element there, which was where I wanted to go next. And when we're thinking of regenerative agriculture, people talk about mindset shift, and it's a conversation I've had over the course of the last 5 or 7 years that I've been doing this podcast and working in this area, where what the first thing anybody who's involved in regen will say, it's about mindset, it's about the mindset shift, which in itself I think is quite a remote concept, for people who
Yeah, it
haven't
is.
yet sort of got into that. So in terms of mainstream agriculture in the US, in the face of the promotion, the lobbying, the government support, how difficult is that shift for the mainstream farmer in the United States?
Um, it- it- you know, it depends on who you're talking to. There's, within every community or every population, you've always got the wackos who are always testing the boundaries, right? And for
Mhm.
them, that identity change is really simple.
Mhm.
It's a part of who they are. But for the rest of society, it's challenging. I mean, you have to stand up in front of your family and your community and the people at the coffee shop that you talk with every day, and you have to abandon that tribe. And that's really hard unless you've got support that is somehow saying, listen, this is going to work. We're in the same boat as you, right? We're experiencing these same hurdles. We're experiencing these same successes, and this is how we're doing it. That community becomes really essential in that identity change, doesn't it?
Mhm, mhm. I mean, I'm sort of, as you say there, you're talking about the way in which, society is made up of innovators and followers, I guess. And I
Yeah.
guess with the innovators, as you say, that mindset shift is something that they can feel, that they can do, that they're excited about, and they want to be able to succeed in. For an awful lot of farmers, as I mentioned before, there is this sort of degree of painting by numbers. And I think the conversation that we're starting to get to in the UK now is there's sort of friction between those people you might call regen purists and those people who are sort of more practical and they just want to see some change on the ground, whatever that change is. And I wonder
Yeah.
if you think it's possible to, for those people who aren't innovators naturally, is it possible to take regen agriculture and somehow not codify it? That's not quite the right sort of way of thinking about it, but somehow boil it down to a set of practices and delivery principles. Is that possible, or is it something
Um,
that you rail against yourself?
yeah. So, okay. So, of these farms that we've studied with 1,000 farms, I mean, it goes from, very conventional to very regenerative. We have a scoring system in order to attain that, right? It goes from 0 to 8. And along that, I mean, every farm falls on that continuum. And I can make pretty accurate predictions in about 2 minutes worth of questions as far as where you fit on that continuum and what we're going to see on your farm in terms of organic matter and water infiltration, how many lady beetles, how happy you are, whether you have cancer in your family. Um, Within that system, okay, we have to say, okay, everybody on that side of the system, on that side of the number is conventional. Everybody on this side is regenerative, and that's our construct, right? Okay, and we try to support that based on the outcomes of regenerative ag, what they're supposed to be doing. Um, what we're finding is that there's actually three categories. There's the industrial conventional model, right? We all know what that looks like. It's very simple. It's monocultures that's maintained with agrochemical inputs. Okay, and then you've got these conventional farmers that are like, boy, this regen thing, I could cash in, man. I could make some money, but I think or I think that this might be something worth trying. And maybe there's something broader about it, the health of their family or something, but they don't want to, they're risk averse and they don't want to go too far. So I'm going to replace all of my conventional inputs with these regenerative inputs. And we're kind of calling that the industrial regenerative
Mhm.
side of things. Or maybe they're reducing chemical inputs a little bit, in order to make the system, but we still have to have them. And then on the final, group over here, you've got the regenerative. And I'm a horrible marketer, but you get the idea. The people that are really pushing it, right? Um, if we want to attain the maximum impact on carbon capture and storage, on soil health, on biodiversity, on water cycling, on profitability and nutrient density of the foods, on reducing pollution, we're not going to do that with an industrial conventional model. We can get better, but if you really want to attain those outcomes, we have to be pushing towards the regenerative class.
Yeah. Yeah, I like the way that you frame that in terms of the 2 minutes of questions, and you can work out where people are on the scale. And there was, I learned recently that there was some research going into people who are narcissists, and I think that the researchers had come up with something like 40 questions, and through those
Yeah.
40 questions, they could work out whether somebody was a narcissist or not. And then they worked out at the end that actually they only needed one question. It was just, "Are you a narcissist?" And narcissists would always say, "Yeah." Absolutely. And there must be one question, mustn't there? One question that
Yeah.
somewhere that tells us this. Look, before
And
we
the
go,
questions we
go
ask are practice based, just like what you were saying, but
on.
it's really important to not make this about those practices.
Mhm.
Those practices that we ask about are actually proxies of a management philosophy. And we
Yeah,
can't ignore that as we're thinking about certification programs or policies that are trying to promote regenerative. Otherwise, we're going to take the same route as organic went, where it gets bastardized pretty darn quickly.
yeah, yeah. Look, I want to talk about your work at Ecdysis and Blue Dasher, but before we do, you obviously, as I mentioned in the intro, were an advisor for on GM crop risk for regulatory agencies in the US. I wonder if you could just tell me a little bit about that and how you assess risk in relation to GM crops.
Hmm. Yeah, so for most of my career, ecological risk assessment of, of farm management, I would say, but also specifically GM crops and insecticides and pesticides in general, was kind of a cornerstone of what I did. And so working with the European Food Safety Authority, the EPA, other governments, yeah, there aren't that many people working on those questions, or
Mm.
certainly not enough people working on those questions. Um, yeah, and so how do you assess the risk? Good question.
And I ask that partly because I think, for a lot of people, they would either say, certainly in the early days of GM, when, there was lots of sort of fear around, what GM was, people would have either said, yeah, it's great, it's a new technology, let's go with it. And other people would just say, no, 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 no. And there
Yeah.
wasn't sort of much nuance in between. So I just wonder how you find that nuance.
Well, GM crops was really formative in how we approach ecological risk assessments. I mean, BT corn, BT cotton, I mean, those before those hit, risk assessment was kind of like, yeah, we've got this scenario, right? We've got toxicity plus exposure equals risk. And but nobody really knew what that meant as far as trying to assess the complexity of an ecological system. And maybe in the water world, there was a little better picture of it, but certainly within agriculture, we hadn't confronted this. And genetically modified crops really changed that. Um, yeah. So, how long is your show, right? I mean, this is after working, I can tell you right now, after working on this for 30 years, um, I do not believe that we have a very good perception of how to assess risk.
Okay.
Um, that it's extremely complicated, and that the complexity of the natural world is indeed so complicated that how on earth can we assess the risk? So I my research was part of the reason why we've got BT corn, right? I mean, we followed the equation. I assessed the toxicity of BT corn to non-target organisms, especially things like lady beetles, which were good organisms. We wanted to keep those in the fields, right? And then we looked at exposure of those under field conditions. And try as I might, I couldn't assess the toxicity. There was no toxicity, direct toxicity towards these lady beetles. And so, but at the same time, as a scientist, as a risk assessor, I mean, I couldn't deny in my gut that this wasn't the right route. Um, and I was right, but BT crops kills biodiversity in ways that I don't think that we appreciated or could or had a good system for assessing. It destroys biological communities because it upholds a broken agricultural system.
Mm. Mm.
I mean, you wouldn't, at least in the US, you wouldn't be a good corn farmer for very long by growing corn on corn on corn if you didn't have BT corn.
Mm.
Doesn't mean that the BT toxin, the endotoxin that's expressed by those plants is toxic to all of that biodiversity. But what it did was it allowed pest-free corn production to proliferate, and that has been like an asteroid to biodiversity on Earth.
Are you able to sort of look at these things in retrospect? Is there, I mean, how does it work in the US? Because my kind of feeling, my guess is that once something's on the market, once it's been assessed as, as as having an acceptable risk, that once it's there, you can't just kind of reverse that policy decision and say we're going to get rid of it. That once it's there, it's there. And if you try, then you're getting into all kinds of legal wrangles with the companies that own the patents on those things. Is that correct, or is it possible to sort of say, well, we've redone that risk assessment with 20 years of knowledge, and we think that we need to update that information?
Um, it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle,
Yeah, that
but
was a simple way of
um,
asking the question.
but there is approaches to it. But a risk formulation isn't sophisticated enough to ask the question of is BT corn good or bad for
Mhm.
biodiversity, or what the implications of that is, because
Okay.
it's okay at assessing toxicity and exposure, but those aren't necessarily the best metrics of risk. The best metrics of risk is imagine widespread adoption of this particular technology and its implications. But boy, to assess that requires pretty far sight, and it requires a knowledge of such a complex system that it would be really hard. And imagine applying that not just to BT corn, but to agricultural in general. And suddenly well, you would start doing research on regenerative ag.
During the over the course of the last 20 or 30 years, that I've kind of been aware of genetic modification, gene engineering of one kind or another, the sort of conversation, and I think it feels that the science has sort of changed to that. When we were first talking about this in the UK, it was about the introduction of foreign genes into, for example, a plant species, and that foreign gene was unlocking or locking up particular activities by that plant, where gene engineering now seems to be much more about tweaking genes within a species itself, sort of turning up the red in a tomato or something. Is that
Hmm.
accurate? And is there a difference in your mind? Do you think that um, there's a difference between the introduction of foreign genes or just sort of fixing genes within a species itself? Is one inherently safer than the other?
So one is not inherently safer than the other. I think characterizing what the risks are and is maybe requires different approaches
Mm.
for the two forms of genetic modification of plants. Um, but to say one's good and one's bad is probably a little naive.
Mhm.
That yeah, I mean, this is yeah, I mean this gets to be very complicated, doesn't it? I mean, we did some of the first risk assessments of RNAi technology, which is gene silencing, and we found that there was a lot of off-target potential risks on non-target organisms, things that this technology wasn't supposed to kill. It might silence their genes, including people. Um, Proving that becomes very challenging. But knowing that it's there is probably the first step. And I don't know, boy, a precautionary principle sure seems like it would make a lot of sense there of do no harm, right?
Mm. Mm.
Um,
You
yeah, and we really
mentioned
put it all
uh,
into context of is
mm.
there other alternatives?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Because you were talking about the genie and the bottle there, and the sense, very much that I was getting from you is that no, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. And if we're applying the precautionary principle, then probably we ought to just not be doing this stuff. Is that an accurate characterization of where you are, or do you think that there is a role for GM?
I don't pick a fight with the GM, the pro GM crowd anymore. To me, I think a more effective strategy is why would I buy something I don't need? And as a farmer, I could tell you that that seems to resonate. I mean, I'm not saying ban stuff. As soon as you say it, start saying, farmer, I'm taking away something from you. Oh yeah, get ready, right? But if you say, why are you buying all that crap? That's dumb. Then suddenly that gets their attention a little bit more because they don't want to be used by anybody, certainly not the government, but also not by large corporations. And right now, the best marketing tools that these corporations are using are, boy, we're here to serve and we're saving your guys' butts. And if you don't use our product, you're going to lose everything. Those resonate with these farmers. They think that they've got some savior and they've been tricked into becoming patsies for these large corporations.
We should talk.
Pass-through dollars, ways of these corporations to milk the governments, the federal governments of every penny that they're worth via the farmer.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We should talk about the Ecdysis Foundation and Blue Dasher, and just help me out with how the two are linked, and then what's the purpose of the foundation and the farm?
Well, we're 10 years old. This is our 10th anniversary. Crazy that we're still around. So I worked for the federal government for a long time, doing risk assessments. It got the water was getting hotter and hotter and starting to bubble. And I'm like, this isn't, I can drive from my house in South Dakota over to Minnesota where my folks live. All of my research, all of these accolades, 150 papers and my first book by the age of 30 and millions in grants and federal things aren't getting better, right? And I'm sitting here as a scientist saying to everybody how I'm helping. And I'm like, this isn't working, right? I think we all need to be, doing those self-assessments every once in a while. Is it working? Farmers do, beekeepers do over here, that's for sure. Um, and then if it's not working, why isn't it? And going through that process, it became really clear that agricultural science, as it's being practiced today, I think that it's missing its mark. Um, and so I started to say, okay, so if we wanted to use science within agriculture to actually move the needle to help foster an evolution of our food system, what would that look like? And the first step in that process was stepping out, and the scientists had to become farmers. And so Ecdysis Foundation, we have about 40 on staff at various scientific levels, and everybody helps on the farm. They've all got crap on their shoes and dirt under their fingernails on an operating regenerative farm. And that first step, boy, that was essential because it changed the questions that we ask and it changed how we ask them. I was um, I was out in vineyards in California working with one of my graduate students. He was working on sheep integration in the vineyards and met one of the vineyard operators. Um, and and she was talking to Tommy, and I went over and shook her hand, and she's like, your hands are dirty." And I'm like, I'm sorry. Yeah, I was just out digging those probes and stuff. I should, yeah. She's like, no, that's a good thing. And the conversation that happened after that was different than I think the ones that she has with normal academic scientists. I think that yeah, this style is, yeah, it's a number one. I never go onto a farm saying I'm the expert and you should be doing this.
Mhm.
Scientists were never meant to be the experts on farming. We were always meant to be servants. And that is a pretty important mind shift right there.
And Blue Dasher is the farm that's where the work takes place, I guess, for the
Yeah.
Ecdysis Foundation. Yeah, yeah,
Well, yeah, that's the headquarters. We
yeah.
don't actually do any research on Blue Dasher Farm proper. Blue
Okay.
Dasher Farm is actually an operating farm. We raise
Mhm.
lamb, honey. Christina's got a hell of a cut flower operation now, poultry, local eggs and meat. Um, and then we have orchard system. It's a pretty integrated farm.
And you said that this all sort of stemmed from that kind of self-assessment 10 years ago when you were taking that drive. And despite all the accolades, things didn't seem to be changing. 10 years on, through the work that you've been doing since then, do you think things are changing now?
Yeah, it's at least certainly in the U.S. Um, the word regenerative agriculture. I mean, 10 years ago, nobody knew what this was, right?
Mm.
And now it's almost dangerously changed or has received so much attention that and without clear definition, which is troubling. But we're trying to help with that. We've we've visited, right? We've gone out and visited 1,700 farms. Like I said, in every single community that I have been in across the continent, there's some farmer that's pushing this.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
And when you look at the trajectory of nonviolent revolutions throughout human history, there's tipping points.
Mhm.
And it's about 3%, scientifically, it's about 3% of the population is necessary to be converted before it snowballs into fixation.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're past that. If by my assessments, I think we're past that. That doesn't mean that we're there, but I think that history is going to look back at this moment just like we did with BT crops. BT crops were the fastest adopted technology in agriculture that's ever happened before. I have a feeling that regenerative ag is going to be a similar situation.
So the revolution is possible, even if it's not quite
It's
rolling just
happening.
yet. Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
happening.
I want to move on and sort of spend the rest of the program really talking about soil, if that's okay. But before I do, there's just because I know that pest management is an important part of your work, and because we're going to be doing some other programs on pest management over the course of the next few weeks and months, I just wanted to ask you about that. Moving away from chemicals and towards that sort of integrated management, attracting beneficial insects. You mentioned ladybirds earlier on, for example, to combat harmful insects. And it's a big area. And like GM, I'm not expecting you to sort of be able to tell me everything. But just briefly, I wonder if you could run through a couple of easy wins.
Plant life on your farm. That is from all of our work, all of our research, that's the one thing that delivers simultaneously on almost every regenerative outcome. It restores soil. It restores, it helps to combat greenhouse gas emissions and balance those equations. It helps on water infiltration. It provides nutrition. It manages pests. Through through competition, through predation, and establishing trophic relationships. I mean, science has known this for a long time. So the idea is at every step of your operation, am I killing life or growing it? Ask that question. And if it's killing life, find a different way. You'll find that your pest problems were never the problem. Your pest problems were always a symptom.
Yeah. Yeah. So if I were to wrap that up, then essentially that's diversity and abundance, having a variety and having lots of it.
And it starts with plants. And that's I mean that's the one tool that farmers have tremendous control over, right? I mean, putting carbon in the ground is a bit tricky, right? Unless you go out and buy, yeah, some charcoal maker or something along these lines, right? But by planting trees and planting, cover crops and keeping that soil covered and boy, that's a number one, it's pretty cheap. And and number two, I mean, that's the start of everything. Because the biology, the biomass, the abundance, the diversity of every other organismal group on Earth scales with how many plants are in a community. That's how the energy gets out of the sun and into the system is via photosynthesis.
So let's talk about soil, which is clearly at the heart of your research. And it's often said that we know more about the moon than we do about the earth beneath our feet. And I guess, I mean, it's a really basic question, but I'm pretty certain the answer isn't basic. What is soil?
Soil is the biological, physical, and chemical underpinning of ecosystems. I mean, in a nutshell,
Mhm.
um, it is life that's been converted into something that we can use to produce and grow plants and microbes. I don't know. In a nutshell, that's really what it is. We
Mm.
need to be thinking of it's not separate from life and the history of a piece of ground. Um, and it's not an inanimate, um, static substrate either.
I
I mean,
guess
there's
I'm
elements of that.
sort of asking, about the different components, that make up soil. When I'm talking to groups, I'll often say, if you imagine that sort of greatest sci-fi movie you ever saw, the most complex city, that's been created in the sky, basically that soil, it's that level of complexity and again, diversity and all these other things. But there's so much that makes up soil, which is what makes it sort of so complex.
Millions and millions of years of events and even decisions are what makes up a piece of soil, right? Yeah, there's legacy, there's history there, but there's also life, and that's the important part. For so many years, you know, that are living through chemistry, which helped to develop the industrial mindset of soils. Okay, your soil is deplete in this micronutrient and this macronutrient, and put that in from this other source, and suddenly you've got plants growing. Um, I think that was a bit myopic, and the role of biology and ecology is now understood at a greater level. But even that is still problematic. I mean, I still struggle getting our research papers put out into the scientific literature because, for example, mineralized carbon or inorganic carbon, people think only comes from parent material, and I'm like, I mean, we're showing pretty clearly that at depth we're getting inorganic carbon that's being created and it's correlated with the amount of key organismal groups, fungi, earthworms, invertebrates, things like this that are, I think, generative when it comes to inorganic source or pools of carbon.
So they're creating these pools of
Not, yeah,
carbon.
not only that, but I think we'd see even higher levels of inorganic carbon up towards the soil surface if we didn't have such a rich biological group interacting with it and cycling it mineralized, organic forms to mineralized to organic forms. I think that is a better way of thinking um, about that pool of carbon than well, it starts at the bottom because it's from the parent material and it's from that bedrock. I'm like, no, I think it's there. It's just in a weird cycle that's kind of ongoing all the time.
And so is that taking it down through the stratas of the soil?
Yeah, it is.
It's actively sort of bringing it deeper and deeper and deeper until you get to the bedrock.
Yeah, and that's not to say that parent material isn't important in defining soil structure and things like that. But what I'm saying is that we really, especially as farmers, we need to understand that that management matters. That you're not just beholden to yeah, what your farm happened to have for soil. That you have power over that too. Doesn't mean that that doesn't influence how you approach it, but I think we need to, yeah,
Is there
it's empowering when you think about it. Let's put it that way.
is there in most soils, is there a plateau or saturation point, do you think? Because again, this has been something that's, been contentious depending on which scientist you're talking to. In your view, can soil keep on absorbing carbon? Can you keep on growing soil?
Hmm. I think, yeah, I think that our models and our perceptions from from an academic standpoint or a logical standpoint are done in such a way that does not appreciate the complexity of that ecological world. I have not seen a plateau um, because you generate more soil on top of it, right? Once your current base is saturated, the timing in which that happens, the degree and quickness of how much that occurs is influenced by many factors. But regenerative farming, the rule system was created for industrialized conventional models. And those rules do not apply to a regenerative farm very well.
It does seem very difficult for some of the scientists that I've come across in the UK to kind of break out of some of those mindsets, even when they're people who, see themselves as ecologists and, people who really genuinely want to be able to promote the idea of sustainability within farming.
Why is that? Why do you think that is?
I really don't. I think it's as you say. I think it's about the constraints of the scientific process that they're involved in, and their inability to kind of think beyond that into. So one of the questions I was going to ask you was around Donald Rumsfeld. So Donald Rumsfeld's the former U.S. Secretary of Defense, and he always talked in terms of known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And it seems to me that a lot of soil scientists are working with those known knowns and they're really scared of the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. So I wonder
Yeah.
if, I can, without being too kind of confusing, whether I could ask you in terms of soil science to talk me through, a few of those things. What do you think it is that everybody knows? And what are those things that, they kind of know that they don't quite know yet, and those things actually that, genuinely we suspect there's something out there, but we really haven't quite got a clue yet.
That's a hard, yeah, it's kind of a hard
It's a
question to
hard
ask
question.
or answer, I guess.
Maybe we should break it down a little bit. And if I
Maybe,
sort of,
yeah.
why do you think it is that scientists get caught up and think that there is this plateauing, that carbon moves in a pretty linear fashion within the soil strata, and then once it's there, that's it, and you've got to move on to a new piece of ground if you want to absorb more carbon.
Yeah. I mean, some of that is early scientific findings, and a lot of that is social. Um, the only way that you so number one, I read a statistic that 10% of the scientific community is represents something like 90% of the scientific articles. That means that there's gatekeepers,
Mhm.
essentially. And once you have staked the claim, um, then your reputation is based on that, and self-assessment becomes very challenging, isn't it? I mean, admitting that you were wrong, even in the face of data. Um, you're the expert, aren't you? The and so once some of these equations were created early days, they I don't think that there was any yeah, malicious intent. I think that they were taking the best information of the day. And the way that you overturn that is with a preponderance of evidence. But if the only peer reviewers that you got to where they are because they adhered to the current system, it's really tough to overturn that apple cart. And that's part of, yeah, apple cart turning has been a cornerstone of my career, and is something that we're trying to do within this regenerative space. It's some days it's easy and some days it's not.
So in terms of that apple cart turning, I guess that's the known unknowns, isn't it? And that feels like that's where you're working. That's talking
Sometimes I
about that.
think of Ecdysis Foundation as the X Files of agriculture, right? Like there's a whole lot of regenerative farmers that are soil health and biodiversity. These things are helping, and then but there's also wacko ideas like that may or may not be real. I don't know, but that cell phones are contributing to this, and electromagnet and new color wavelengths and stuff are influencing this, and that if you put the spleen of a deer in your field at a certain time, that this is going to say. So I think that status quo isn't getting us where we have to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so Ecdysis was kind of created to start investigating some of these not so status quo solutions that farmers are talking about. And it becomes a slippery slope. And I don't know where the end is on that, but we just take it one step at a time, I guess. But regenerative farming, I mean, is supported now, at least, boy, I could tell you by a mountain of data that we've generated.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
Now we're trying to get into more fringe stuff yet.
And I guess that's that cycling that you were talking about, that sort of, carbon moving up and down, cycling around in the soil, going ever deeper. That's part of that, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah, it becomes a part of the vernacular, and that's yeah. Where is these sort of forms of soil genesis and what our food system is capable of? Because when I was getting into this, as a pest manager, I mean, people were telling me you can't farm without pesticides, and I'm still told that. But these farmers were telling me, no, I don't use any, and I'm like, that's not true. And so I went out and I saw it, and it was true, and that's what prompted a lot of this vein of research down this regenerative agriculture route.
Mm. What do you think the next kind of horizon is in terms of soil science? Do you have a sense that it may be something that you haven't quite locked down in your mind yet, but there are sort of areas that you kind of feel that there needs to be research into, but you're not quite sure really what that is yet?
I think agriculture is the solution to climate change. And despite our current climatological models, um, restoring ecosystems on these managed lands is going to have far greater implications than current models predict.
Mm.
And so I think that needs to be, yeah, scientists that are developing the models need to get away from their desk. They need to actually meet farmers that are generating these forward-thinking systems.
I wanted to
I
ask
think that
you.
that's the future.
I mean, I think, within that, we've kind of gone through through the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. So thanks for that, because I think it's fascinating, and I appreciate that it's really difficult, especially when you're talking to non-scientists, to try and explain, these things that you're thinking about and working on, and how important they are. And as you say, that climate prism is going to be fantastically important. I was thinking that it might be a good idea just to sort of think about some of the practicalities, because a lot of the people listening to the podcast, there will be farmers and they'll have opinions on some of the things that we talked about. But certainly when it comes to one of those sort of key conversations within the regenerative movement, glyphosate or the plow. I just wonder, what your view is in terms of, when we're thinking about soil, we're thinking about soil disruption, either chemical disruption or physical disruption. Um, and within that, when we're thinking of, the difference between deep plowing, shallow plowing, lots of glyphosate, a little bit of glyphosate, I wonder if you have a view at this stage as to which is better from your perspective.
I don't think those are the only two options. And I think that we hamstring ourselves when we go that route because neither of them is particularly good. Um,
So talk to me
both of
about
them
the
kill life.
alternatives. Yeah.
Both of them kill life. Um,
And
perenniality.
sorry, just
Perenniality, introducing perenniality into our systems, getting away from monoculture-based agriculture, instituting perennial cover or annual covers at the very least, integrating animals into that system that can take advantage and manage those plant communities.
Jonathan, just before we sort of go more into that sort of perennial element, are you able just to sort of talk me quite briefly through what happens when glyphosate, goes onto the land? What happens? What's the damage that it's doing? And likewise with a plow, what is the damage that a plow is doing? And then perhaps we can go into that, more nuanced solution.
Um, okay, what happens when you till? First off, the you're disturbing the physical and biological structure of that soil, okay, which influences the chemical structure of the soil. So what happens is when you till that, you introduce a lot of air and new organic matter that results in a bacterial flash, boom, that
Mhm.
results in high fertility for that year.
Yeah.
But what it does is that takes advantage of a lot of the organic matter that's in that soil. And so having a balanced fungal bacterial ratio becomes very important for long-term degradation and incorporation of new organic matter. Um, the only way to restore that organic matter back into your system is through external inputs or through biology. And the problem with tillage is that it's a 1-2 punch, right? It knocks out that organic matter and then it also knocks out the biology that's necessary in order to restore it.
Mhm.
And so you see this degradation in fertility and soil structure over years. But that's hard to see, right? I mean, when you're losing a millimeter or two of soil a year, you forget that, okay, well, by the end of my life, there's going to be a pretty good chunk of my topsoil is going to be gone.
Yeah.
Um,
And in
with
terms of,
herbicides,
yeah,
pardon, no, go ahead. Yeah,
no,
you
I
got
was
a
going to
question.
say, yeah, in terms of herbicides.
Uh, in herbicides, there's direct toxicity and there's indirect effects. Okay, so there is direct toxicological impacts of the herbicide and the carrier. Glyphosate is not the worst herbicide. Paraquat's probably worse,
Mm.
but all these farmers in North America are talking, "Oh God, we're going to use paraquat instead of glyphosate and do something good." I'm like, guys, that's dumb.
Mhm.
Um, so these so there's direct toxicological effects of the herbicide. It disrupts microbial communities, especially, and symbioses that happen, and organismal interactions. Your gut is disrupted, gut microbiome. But then it also changes the plant community. And those changes to the plant community have far-reaching implications for biodiversity promotion.
And so if working on the assumption, as you sort of did to begin that answer, that neither is a good solution, what is the good solution?
Um, perenniality. Getting annual and perennial covers on every inch of your soil. Grazing integration. So using those covers as a source of revenue as well as management. Um, yeah, those are good things. Diversifying your farm away from a monoculture.
Mhm. So sort of keeping everything covered, and again, sort of using those different crops as they go in at different times to sort of contribute to that diversity that you need on
Absolutely.
a
Yep.
field. Now we're We're more or less, we've more or less out of time. It feels like the hour's gone very quickly. But
Mhm.
I just wonder, for farmers who haven't yet made that leap into regenerative agriculture, could you just sort of, spend 30 seconds, 60 seconds making the case for regen, why they should do it and what they should do first, how they should get started?
How they should get started is develop a system on a small part of your farm where you're adopting multiple regenerative practices simultaneously rather than just dipping a toe in. Like, I'm going to go no-till this year. Because oftentimes those toe in situations tend to lead to failure. And you need some early wins in order to make this work. Scale it up from there. Get involved with a community and a support network that you can ask questions and share your stories with. Um, a lot of times people tell me, well, John, this regenerative ag thing sounds really great, but what's it going to cost me to change? I think that's the wrong question. I think it's going to, what's it going to cost you not to change? It's going to cost you your farm. It's going to cost you your grandkids. Is that worth it? We have an answer in front of us. This is doable. We've seen it work in every ecoregion and in every food system that we've explored. Now we got to get to work.
Why is it going to cost them their farm and cost them their grandkids?
The toxicity of the agrochemical environment that you're creating, the social stresses of an industrialized model that leads to family dissolution and community dissolution, the economic brittleness of the current system, the contributions that it's having to broader ecological and planetary problems.
And of course, I guess on top of that, the reliance on petrochemicals and uh, things that are imported from around the world, a reliance on stability in the world when stability seems to be something which is in short supply at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, I was in Napa at a grower meeting, right? And my grad student was studying those sheep integration into beet vineyards. And there was a lady, a farmer, that was doing a little bit of research there, and and she was comparing for vegetation management, mowing versus grazing versus glyphosate, and um, and she's like, these were all equally effective, but the glyphosate was so much cheaper that everybody should probably do that. And I got up after her, and I'm like, let's play this out. We know that herbicides are toxic, right? But let's walk this down the chessboard a few moves. You're at the end of your life, and you have to stare your spouse in the eye, and you have to say, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I thought it was my job to save money. I thought I was being a good farmer, and I'd heard that these chemistries were causing us trouble, and now our grandkids are sick, and I'm sorry." Does that cut it? I don't think it does.
Look, that's all we've got time for. And it's been really fascinating talking to you, Jonathan. And thanks so much for your time. I appreciate that we've kind of gone over quite a lot of ground and dipped in there. And it's been really interesting. So thank you very much. I'd like to thank my guest, Dr. Jonathan G. Lundgren. If you've enjoyed listening, please come back and listen to more. Tell your friends, like us, review us, and share our links. Farmgate is the world's highest ranking food security podcast. We're part of 8.9.com, the land use news channel, which is supported by First Milk, Pelican Ag, the Nature Friendly Farming Network, Friars More, Livestock Health, Agrolo, and individual donors. And I've been Finlay Costain. Bye for now.